So this video is mostly to give us some useful common terminology to talk about groups or conditions we might want to compare in a research study. Specifically, we're going to see how to talk about factors in a research study and the levels those factors can have. But to start, it might help to see some examples. So consider research questions like the following. Maybe we might ask, does exercise help depression more than cognitive behavioral therapy? You have an independent variable here with two possible values. That's exercise or CBT that maybe people are randomly assigned to. So there's two groups, and we're going to compare. We're going to see which group ends up with more improvement in depression. So that would be our dependent variable. Or consider this one. Of self-identified dog people or self-identified cat people, who scores higher in anxiety? So there's two groups here, and we want to see which is higher in the DV, anxiety. Or this one, testing whether distraction affects completion of a frustrating task by assigning some people to a distracted situation and others to a non-distracted situation, and then have them all attempt the same task and see who completes it versus who gives up. Now, what's common among all of these setups here, all three of these setups? You might notice that some of these are genuine experiments where we're manipulating an independent variable and randomly assigning people to groups, in other words, assigning them to the versions or the values of that independent variable. But the middle one doesn't really do that. It's not an experiment. It's purely measuring variables, so it's a correlational study. Okay, what else might be common among them? You might notice some of them have a quantitative dependent variable, so the outcome is a number, but that third study has a categorical outcome as a dependent variable. So while the top two might use a t-test to check for statistical significance, whether there's a difference between the groups, the bottom one would use like a chi-square test. So, okay, then what in the world is common between all of these? Well, they all involve comparing two groups, meaning the top variable listed in each of these cases is categorical, in this case with just two categories. And it might help if we have some technical language to describe things like this. So to start, we use the term factor to refer to the variable that scores are grouped by. In other words, the condition that someone is in or assigned to, or the group that they're in. Like whether they're in the exercise group or the CBT group, we say treatment type is a factor that we're going to study to see how it relates to depression, which is our dependent variable. We'd say distraction level was a factor in that third one, meaning whether they were assigned to the distraction condition or the no distraction condition, that is a factor. And we're going to test if it affects task completion, which was the dependent variable. So that sort of thing. If we're doing an experiment, then the independent variable would be a factor that we're testing. Like we want to know if the IV is a factor in determining what the DV value is for someone. And then when we describe a factor, when we're talking about a group variable like treatment type or like gender or like anything like that, we can ask how many levels does this factor have in our study, which just means how many values can it take in my study. So in those earlier examples, the factors we looked at all had two levels, meaning two possible values. And that's it for the way we define things in our study. But surely we can think of times where we might want to study some variable that has three or more groupings, three or more conditions. So for example, if we're studying the safety of different car sizes, then car size is a factor we're interested in. Now, rather than measuring every car in inches, we might actually just kind of simplify things and lump car sizes in our study into three groups. Compact cars, mid-size, and full-size cars. So we'd say the size of the car, that variable is a factor, right? It has three levels. And since those are categorical values, but have a sort of inherent ordering to them, we'd actually say we're measuring this factor on the ordinal scale. Whereas the dependent variable might be something like safety score from 0 to 30, which, maybe is measured on a ratio scale then. Or another study might compare different medications for, cholesterol treatment, where some people are given the new drug, some people get the old kind of standard drug that people have been taking for a while, and some people get an empty placebo pill. So it looks the same. All the pills look exactly the same for people. They have the same expectation, the same placebo effects, but some of them actually have different medication in them. So in this case, we've got a single factor, what we might call, type of pill, or the treatment they're assigned to, and that factor has three levels. In other words, pill type is our independent variable, so our IV has three levels, and then we'll just measure the DV of cholesterol number at the end for everyone. Of course, we don't have to stop at three levels. We can study a factor where we split it up into four levels or even more. So in this case here, 4 levels of the drug amount is our independent variable, the factor we're looking at, and then we compare how those drug amounts affect someone's hunger level as the dependent variable in this example. We would still say a factor has levels even if there are just 2 levels. Like some people might measure gender by forcing everyone to lump themselves into male or female. It's not necessarily ideal. Then compare and see if one of those groups is more accurate at guessing the current temperature. Notice that in this case, the factor isn't an independent variable that we manipulate. We're not in charge of whether someone is male or female. We don't randomly assign them to that. We just measure it as a participant characteristic. It's something about them. So this could be a totally correlational study, but the point is we've got a grouping variable here, a factor, and this factor happens to have 2 levels. Of course, we could measure gender as a factor with more than 2 levels. So maybe in your study you use the wording suggested by recent kind of federal data collection, where they ask participants, do you describe yourselves as a man, a woman, or some other gender term, like non-binary or genderqueer? If that's how you operationalize the gender variable in your study, you'd say the factor has 3 levels in your study. So the number of levels is dictated by how you're measuring and operationalizing things in your study, how you're kind of lumping things into groups or conditions. It's kind of how many groups or conditions there are for this factor, for this variable. So education level might have, level of education, amount of education, might have 5 levels in some studies, while in others they might break it down into 9 different levels of education, or maybe just 3 or 4 different levels of education. But again, the factor it's basically just the name of the variable that we're studying here, and then the levels are just the values of each group or condition within that. So the names of each group or condition that someone could be for that variable. So one final example, let's say you're comparing oxygen consumption by measuring change in VO2 max levels, maybe before some training regimen and after some training regimen, to kind of get an idea whether maybe it works. So you're measuring everyone's VO2 max at the start of the study, and then everyone in your study does the same training, and then you're going to measure everyone's VO2 max at the end of the study, post-training. The factor then, the training factor, we would say has 2 levels, before training and after training, or pre-training and post-training, even if, in this case, every person gets both of the levels of that factor. That's because factors can be between subjects or they can be within subjects variables, which is basically just asking, does each individual in your study have 1 level of the factor, which would make it a between subjects design, or does each individual in your study show up in all levels of that factor, which would make it a within subjects design, within subjects factor. So when we're comparing safety scores for 3 sizes of cars, that is a between subjects factor. A single car, like a Nissan Altima or whatever, can't be tested in all 3 categories. It is whatever size it is, and that's it. It only shows up in one group, in one condition. For the pill example, the pill type, independent variable here, would be a between subjects factor, assuming that we're randomly assigning people to just get one of those pill types, one of those treatments. On the other hand, it could totally be a within subjects factor in our study if we're setting it up so each person goes through all 3 treatment types, all 3 conditions. Like if each person is given each pill type for 1 month at a time in our study, that would be within subjects for that factor. Now for gender, it's between subjects. You're comparing between those 2 levels, but one person doesn't really show up in both groups. For the training example, though, where everyone got the training and we measured their before score and their after score for the same people, that means training here is a within subjects factor. Each person shows up in both levels of this factor. Now, we won't get into the nitty-gritty of the statistics here, but the most common statistic you'll use when comparing the levels of a between subjects factor would be an ANOVA, which is short for analysis of variance. And specifically, for a between subjects factor, if we're talking about a between subjects factor, we're going to do a between subjects ANOVA. Sometimes you'll see this called an independent measures ANOVA. But you can think of this like a standard t-test, like an independent measures t-test that we usually use to compare 2 different groups. The ANOVA allows us to compare 3 or more, so 3 or more levels of a variable, 3 or more groups. It's a generalization of the t-test that works for a factor with any number of levels. Or maybe you could say the t-test is just a special case of the ANOVA where you're dealing with a factor that has only 2 levels. And again, a between subjects ANOVA is what you'd do if the factor is between subjects, where each subject only gets one level of the factor. Like if you're comparing small, medium, and large dogs, a dog falls into just one of those levels of the size variable. On the other hand, if you have a within subjects factor that has 3 or more levels, then you would do a within subjects ANOVA. Sometimes you'll see this called a dependent measures ANOVA, or maybe a repeated measures ANOVA, because you're taking repeated or multiple measures from each participant, right? Like they're going to be going through each level of the factor if it's within subjects, so you measure each person in each of those conditions. So think of this kind of like a dependent measures t-test, but the t-test only compares 2 levels, 2 groups, or 2 time points, or something like that. Whereas an ANOVA also works for 3 or more levels, when you have 3 or more conditions. And again, we're talking about a within subjects factor here, where each person serves in each of those conditions. Like if we take measurements from everyone at time 1, time 2, time 3, and time 4, then our factor might be time of year, whatever this is. Maybe these are the different seasons. Maybe we're measuring each person once per season. But the point is, every person gives us data from each of the levels of our factor. Now, we won't get further into the stats at this point, but basically when you do an ANOVA, whether it's a between subjects or within subjects ANOVA, you will calculate out an F value, or your stats software will calculate an F value for you, and you can use that to see if it's an extreme enough value to reject the null hypothesis, meaning you might infer that there's a significant difference between the levels of that factor. All right, for now, let's stop here. We'll see in other videos how it's helpful to have this language of factors and levels to describe how we're designing and analyzing more complex studies. Because so far, we've only talked about a study with a single factor, like a single independent variable, to compare the levels of that factor and see if the dependent variable differs on that. But it is possible to do a study with multiple factors, even multiple independent variables, and test them simultaneously to see not only how each one relates to a dependent variable, but which combination of levels of all those factors has a larger or smaller effect than other combinations of levels of all those factors. So we'll see that in another video.